Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I would like to start by thanking very much Professor John Stanley for inviting me to the University of Canberra and for his own continuous support to the Palestinian Israel cause. We met several times and we had very good discussion about the Israel-Palestine conflict. I think it is a very difficult topic to talk about the implication of the Arab Spring on Israel-Palestine conflict, because I think we're still witnessing the beginning of this process in the Arab world, and still we need to wait a little bit to see what will be the final outcome of such democratic transformation and transit. I'd like just, to show you some images from Palestine before 1948, in which you can see now two pictures. This is for Yafa, it's called in Hebrew Yafo, before 1948. And this is one of the Palestinian newspapers before 1948 also. And this is just to show you that, Palestine was there all the time, and the Palestinian people were there before 1948. This is not the topic of mine, but just to give you a sense of Palestine. I'll show you another picture now after 1967. It's my town, Nablus. It's Nablus by night. It's a very beautiful city. I born there, and I'm going now on 15th of August to visit my mother there. And it's a very beautiful city, and I encourage you to go and visit Nablus, which is 3,000 years old. It's a very interesting city. Okay, it's assumed based on the title of this presentation that the issue of present developments in the Arab region, the Israel-Palestine conflict, and the peace process in the Middle East are highly correlated. The historical relationship between the political developments in the Arab region and the Palestinian cause has always been a determinantal factor for the conflict. Within this context, a few examples are warranted. In 1948, 5 Arab states entered into conflict with several Zionist militias that constituted the Israeli army main force. This engagement of the Arab was specifically directed towards the goal of deterring the establishment of the State of Israel on Palestinian land. The eventual defeat of the Arab forces created the new political facts in the region, and it dramatically changed the nature of the Middle East after the establishment of Israel in 1948. This was a substantial event. The other example is this correlated relation between the Arab development and the Palestinian-Israel cause is the result of 1967 war between the Arab states and Israel was the occupation of what has remained of historic Palestine, known as the West Bank and Gaza Strip. In addition to the occupation of some Arab lands, namely the Egyptian Sinai Peninsula and the Syrian Golan Heights. The defeat of the Arab world in this second war has a great impact on the balance of power in the region and was considered a massive political earthquake. Based on this failure of Arab states in dealing with the Palestinian cause, the Palestinian people decided to take the lead and establish the Palestinian Liberation Organization as the sole and legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. The Arab Summit Declaration in 1974, confirming that PLO is the sole and legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, this is in 1974, it's a very famous summit after the defeat of the Arab states, had a strong impact on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and the independence of the Palestinian decision-making process and structures. In this context, the aggressive confrontation between PLO and the Jordanian government in 1970 resulted in the withdrawal of PLO from Jordan to Lebanon. Furthermore, the Lebanese Civil War in 1975 and the withdrawal of PLO from Lebanon in 1982 as a result of the Israeli-Palestinian war at the same year has changed the political balance of power between the relevant parties, especially after the signing of the Camp David agreements between Israel and Egypt, and accordingly, the withdrawal of the biggest power in the Arab world in the region from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In addition, the two Gulf Wars have devastated consequences of the balance of power in the region and have enforced Israel and PLO to sign the Oslo Agreement on September 1993. It can be concluded from what has been mentioned above, these are just some examples, that the core issue and root cause of the problems in the Middle East is concentrated or focused on the Palestinian-Israel conflict, and the region will not settle down and enjoy stability until this issue is resolved. Also, it is noticed at current times that besides the local and domestic objectives of Arab revolts against dictatorship and corruption, it is still the Palestinian cause persisting and is strongly presented through the various Arab summits and Arab League meetings and in the squares of revolutions, like at Tahrir Square in Egypt. There are a lot of Palestinian flags through this protest. The second title I'd like to talk about it is give you a brief, a summary of this relationship between the developments in the Arab world and the Palestinian-Israel conflict. The Arab and Palestinian basis and foundation for solving the Israel-Palestine conflict. The Arab position towards the Palestine-Israel conflict has polarized around the Arab Peace Initiative that has been adopted by the Arab Summit in Beirut, Lebanon in 2002, and has further been confirmed and stressed upon by consecutive Arab summits. This peace initiative has been the formal plan for Arab and Palestinian mobilization on the international arena to resolve the Palestinian issue. The Arab Peace Initiative is based on a number of principles, as you can see from here. This is the original, authentic copy version of the Arab Peace Initiative adopted by Arab Summit in 2002 in Beirut. Establishing normal relations with Israel in exchange of Israeli complete withdrawal from the Palestinian and Arab occupied territories in 1967. So this is the first time the Arabs said, it's not just recognizing Israel, it's to establish normal relation with Israel. And you know in political science, legitimacy is not just by recognition, it's just by establishing normal relation with your neighbors. Australia will be like more legitimate country if established good relations with Indonesia, Malaysia, and their own neighbors. So this was very important. For the first time, 23 Arab countries said that we'd like to normalize relations with Israel. And this is followed by the also Islamic countries, more than 66 countries who said, yes, we adopt the Arab Peace Initiative and would like to endorse it, and we support our Arab colleagues to do that. So this is very important, and unfortunately it has been totally ignored by the Israelis. So this is the first element of it. It's a deal. If Israel withdraws from all occupied territories in 1967, we will establish normal relation with these guys. The second one is supporting the two-state solution vision, the establishment of a Palestinian independent state within 1967 borders coexist peacefully with the state of Israel. And the third element was very crucial and important, it's the right to return of Palestinians. But for the first time, the Arab Peace Initiative adopted a resolution which talked about accepted resolution to the refugee issue, not just saying right to return of Palestinians. This means that for the first time, the right of return of Palestinian refugees is negotiable. And then it has been elaborated more by the Palestinian leadership. Maybe in the question we can elaborate more about this issue. So it says the peace initiative, a just and accepted solution to the Palestinian refugees issue based on the United Nations Resolution 194, and which includes the right of the Palestinian refugees to return and or to be compensated. But it says accepted, but this is maybe the framework to be solved. So we'd like Israeli to recognize their own moral responsibility of the plight of the refugees, but at the same time, the modalities of implementation will be different. This position adopted by the Arab states and Arab League is based on the Palestinian National Program adopted by PLO in 1988, supporting the two-state solution in addition to the Oslo Declaration of the mutual recognition made by both the Palestinians and Israeli parties, which also support the two-state solution. Okay. This is the Oslo Agreement. It's in 1993, in which Yasser Arafat, the Palestinian leader, sent a letter to Mr. Rabin, one of the former prime minister who was assassinated by the right-wing Jewish in Israel, which includes our own recognition of the state of Israel. So now all the claims that we need to recognize Israel again as Jewish state is just put more obstacles in front of the peace process. So it's just this one saying exactly that and very bluntly that we recognize the state of Israel. And this is the response of Mr. Rabin on our letter about the recognition, and he said that the PLO is the representative of the Palestinian people, and we started then the forthcoming steps of the Oslo Agreement. And in 2009, President Abbas and Yehuda Olmert, the former Israeli prime minister, has agreed on certain understandings regarding the final status issues, like the potential borders between the forthcoming Palestinian state and Israel. This is what is called territorial exchange and swaps, dividing Jerusalem, accepted solution to the refugees issue, security arrangements among each other. Now, these are the most significant issues within the Israel-Palestine conflict. In addition to the Arab Peace Initiative, which deals with some of these important issues, and in addition to the Palestinian program in 1988, which also deals with these issues, the President Abbas in 2009, when we started the Annapolis process in 2007, mediated by the Americans, talked to Olmert, and they agreed on certain issues within these fine status issues. Like for the settlements, the first time that Palestinians really have different scenarios. If the Israeli Jewish or settlers want to stay in Palestine, they can stay in Palestine as Palestinian citizens. And this is very flexible position from the Palestinian. Our position is to dismantle all these settlements because it's, according to international law, it's not legal, but we can be more flexible, to reach the solution by having other options or scenarios how to solve the problem of settlements. Jerusalem is the same thing. Our position is we have like three scenarios. One is international city according to the partition resolution in 181, or two states. East Jerusalem is our state, Israeli state is West Jerusalem, two capitals for two states, or even because of the de facto and building settlements, it becomes one Jerusalem, it's one capital for two states, and we can agree on the arrangements. While the Israeli position is still, this is the eternal unified capital of Israel. And I'd like to tell you something, no solution, no deal between the Palestinians and Arabs and Israel if we don't solve the issue of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is of most importance to the Arabs and the Islamic countries and the Palestinians. So these are issues like security also, because it's important. It's we like to have a sort of demilitarized country. We agree on this concept. We don't want to be militarized at all. We agree to bring international force led by United States or whatever on the borders between Jordan and Palestine. We agree on certain arrangements inside Palestine. We have very successful experience now of joint cooperation between the Palestinian security forces and the Israeli security forces, and this is certified by the Americans because the Americans is leading this process and is training the Palestinian police, and there are a lot of success in this issue. So these three elements, the Arab Peace Initiative, the Palestinian program, and the agreements understanding between Olmert and Abbas are the basis for the current political position of the Arab states. Having recognized the firm basis of any future political deal between the Palestinians and Israelis, the main question in this context is, are there going to be any positive or negative implication of Arab Spring in supporting the above-mentioned principles, concepts, and understandings that have been concluded by the Arabs and the Palestinians? So this is the topic of our own discussion. Is the Arab Spring will influence this political position of the Arabs and the Palestinians? If there's any influence on this or not? Are these understandings going to be sustained in front of Arab Spring? Or Arab Spring will impose changes to these principles and understandings, thus proposing a new framework for Arab joint cooperation, and in particular with regard to the rise of the Islamic Brotherhood movement taking power in Egypt, Tunisia, Morocco, and maybe in Syria? Or it depends on the positive response of the Israeli government to the requirements of a decent deal and agreement to Israel-Palestine conflict. So this is very important question, and we need to wait to see what will happen. Is the government in Egypt, as an example, will support these spaces or will adopt different direction? So the best method or methodology to discuss this issue for me is to talk about the opportunities established, created by the Arab Spring, and the threats, challenges, risks also created by the Arab Spring. So I'll start with the opportunities. The first opportunity is the Arab leaders can no more ignore or take individual positions that are not in coherence with the interests of their people and their political, economic, and social agenda. And they can no more serving other agendas of foreign countries. This leadership is elected and accountable in front of its people, and this accountability will create responsibility for the elected governments as partners with the international community. This means that these emerging democracies will not adopt an uncalculated risks taking into consideration the check and balance balances mechanisms created by an accountable system. So there is now check and balance system for accountability. The Arab Spring, the second opportunity, the Arab Spring is creating a window of opportunity for Israel to seriously revise its extreme strict positions toward the Israel-Palestine conflict and to adopt a more practical and pragmatic approach to strengthen the peace process instead of continuing to adopt stands that are based exclusively on power and sometimes naked power or religious, ideological, and historical concepts like Judea and Samaria, like the Jewish state. I don't think that they are ready now, especially this right-wing government, to adopt a pragmatic approach to the Palestinian-Israel conflict, which has been elaborated and clarified well between the President Abbas and Olmert. This is from Egypt, one of the Arab Spring. Therefore, at present, there is a historical opportunity to reach a resolution to the Palestinian-Israel conflict. If Israel grasps this opportunity and benefit from the democratic changes sparked by the Arab Spring, Israel claims consistently that it is the only democracy in the Middle East and does not have partners for peace. The opportunity is there now, and I hope that Israel shows leadership and grasps this opportunity. Resolving the Israel-Palestine conflict will strengthen the democratic processes and process in the Arab world and will create new horizons for the Middle East. In this context, it's expected that the new emerging leadership will abide by the principles and foundations of the current peace process to resolve the Palestinian-Israel conflict, and will adopt a foreign policy coherent with these principles and foundations. Furthermore, it's also expected that the new leadership, as a responsible party, will not adopt any diplomatic initiatives or activities or to impose on the Palestinian leadership to take steps that are not coherent with these principles and foundations. And that includes the establishment of a just and sustainable solution for the Middle East and not temporary solution based on principle of power and ideologies. Moreover, these resolutions should be in coherence with the international law and United Nations resolutions and as a general framework of resolving the Palestinian-Israel conflict. The other opportunity is the peaceful demonstrations and the non-violent approach of Arab revolts have weakened the groups calling for violent means to resolve the Arab-Israel conflict, and in particular the extremist Islamic groups supported by some regional powers. This change has also positively impacted the strategies of some Islamic groups in Palestine, like Hamas. For example, Hamas has declared to abide by popular resistance against occupation. In addition, Hamas has declared its support to the establishment of a Palestinian independent state in the West Bank and Gaza Strip within 1967 borders. In addition, it has joined the temporary leadership framework of PLO. This was an important development of Hamas positions, supporting the establishment of Palestinian state in 1960 border. They are not anymore talking about Islamic Waqf, we want to eliminate Israel, we don't recognize Israel and other things. And the second issue that now they are joining PLO, in spite of all these problems, and also we can discuss it later, between Fatah and Hamas, PA and Gaza, there are certain understandings between the two parties on these issues in particular. Furthermore, the nonviolent approach has produced an alternative option to terrorism and counterterrorism strategies in the region and may provide an opportunity to create an environment for a peaceful solution to the Israel-Palestine conflict based on the above-mentioned peaceful principles. Nobody talks about terrorism now in the Arab world, or even counterterrorism things, because has been these powers who conduct terrorist activities. I know, 2 days ago there was a terrorist activity, but I'll talk about it. But still, we don't have a sort of war in terrorism now, because these revolutions in Egypt, Tunisia, whatever, reduce this sort of risk. Now we'll come to the risks and challenges. The first challenge and risk is, if Israel does not respond positively to these important changes and believe that the current marginalization of the Palestinian cause is creating an opportunity for it to continue its settlement expansion policy and creating more political facts on the ground and to continue its hard positions toward the final status issues, most importantly, to continue the application of its concept of security, which is based on power and not investing of peace with the Palestinians. This is a big risk. And because of that, my argument here, the main thesis, is the ball now in the court of Israel. And I explained that the Arab Spring will not affect at all the Arab formal positions towards Israel-Palestine. Grabbing the opportunity of the state of chaos by some, this is another threat, by some extreme Islamist group to bring down any opportunity of the peace process by filling in the vacuum and committing military attacks, as the case of the recent attack of Egyptian police in Sinai. The continuation of status quo within the Israel-Palestine conflict will lead to deterioration and accordingly the control of the extremists from both sides on the political process. The third threat is the discontinuation of the democratic process in the Arab world, and the victory of the most conservative groups within the Muslim Brotherhood movement may result in adopting extreme position regarding the Palestine-Israel conflict, and accordingly lead to losing the opportunity of the two-state solution. The last risk is the continuation of the marginalization of the Palestinian cause and the delay by the US to support the Palestinian bid to United Nations as a member state will encourage certain groups and individuals to start thinking of an alternative to the two-state solution as not feasible and to start adopting a vision of one-state solution. And I can also articulate more about this. This movement is gradually growing in the Palestinian diaspora and within the Palestinian inside Israel. Many Palestinian youth groups have influenced by the Arab Spring and the failure of the peace process and start asking for their civil rights and raise the issue of one person, one vote as a democratic solution to Israel-Palestine conflict, in opposition to the PA approach of negotiations and Hamas approach of resistance. And this is a big threat for Israel, because if Israel does not respond, to the peace requirements and not support the two-state solution, what will be the alternative? An apartheid system, because now there is sort of apartheid system already in Palestine, and if they annex the West Bank and continue bringing settlers, whatever, this will be one area. Israel has two options: either to lose their own Jewish character, because we are now equal in Palestine when it comes to population. Now we have 6 million Palestinians in Israel. We have 1.5 million in Israel, 4.2 million in West Bank and Gaza, and we have 6 million Jews in Israel. With the annual birth rate of 4.7 for Palestinians and even 6 in Gaza, 1.7 for Israelis, this means in 2015 will be the majority. What Israel is going to do? Either to discriminate against the majority, and then it will become an undemocratic country, which all the time she was proud of, like one of the most important features of Israel is that it's a democratic country. All have a democratic elections and it loses its own Jewish character. So this is the alternative of Israel, is one-state solution. And because of that, it's for its benefit now to grasp this opportunity and to engage in a serious, genuine discussion about the two-state solution. So this is just, give you an idea about the settlements process and Palestine-Israel, since 1948. This is the Palestinian and Jewish land, 1964. This is before the establishment of Israel. This is Palestine in green, and you see these pockets. This is where Jewish were there. So this was the map of Palestine before the establishment of Israel. This is Palestine-Israel according to 1947 Partition Resolution 181, in which gives Israel 56% of Palestine and gave us 44%. This is the third map, is after 1967 borders. So this is the case there in 1967. This should be the map which we are negotiating now. And these should be the Palestinian land, 6,000 kilometers squares out of 27 kilometer squares. This means 22% of historic Palestine. And this was a big compromise from the Palestinians, because we accepted Israel now on 78% of Palestine, and this has been declared in 1988 by the Palestinian leadership, and we accepted a Palestinian state on only 22%. Unfortunately, because of the settlement activities here, you can see now it's shrinking, and Israel offered us now just 12% of historic Palestine. And they want us to compromise the compromise. We may accept, but the issue is it's not viable, it's not sustainable, it will not solve the problem. So they are building more now settlements there, as you can see, and now we have only some Palestinian pockets within big blocks of settlements, including, of course, East Jerusalem. So these are now what is the Israeli offering to the Palestinians. It's just these green pockets. And because of that, many people now believe that the two-state solution is not feasible. If the Israeli continue their own policy, it's not feasible, because we will not have any Palestinian land to establish the Palestinian state then. So it's sort of grabbing our, of course, water, our land, and unfortunately this government is continuing this policy, and they put a lot of budget of it, and they start to legalize it and produce reports, academic reports to support their own right. And the biggest problem here is the root cause of the problem, that Israel perceived the Palestinian land as disputed. So it's not, they don't recognize themselves as occupation. So they don't recognize of any regime of occupation. And of course, this makes them funny, because it's a joke now in Israel, like when they produced Edmund Levy report saying that West Bank and Gaza is not an occupied territory. So this means they don't recognize it as an occupation. And this means apartheid, this will lead to apartheid system. If you don't recognize that it's an occupation, so how you can recognize it then? So this is a big problem now for the Israelis. They need to solve it. So my conclusion is, it is my strong belief that the foundation and basis for a just and comprehensive peace in the region, especially the vision of the two-state solution, will not be heavily influenced by the Arab Spring. It is also my belief that the new leadership in Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, and Yemen, either Islamic or national or liberal, will support a solution to Israel-Palestine conflict based on the international law principles, United Nations resolution, the Arab Peace Initiative, and the vision of the two-state solution. It's also my strong belief that Hamas will not challenge the new leadership in Egypt and will try to adopt a moderate political program according to the above-mentioned principles if they decide to politically survive. Israel cannot anymore, with the Arab Spring, escape from the peace requirements or maintain the status quo. The balance of power will be changing soon, and the Israeli strong allies have gone, and the United States cannot ignore the developments in the region and the demands by the people to find a just solution to the Palestinian cause. Furthermore, Israel cannot ignore anymore the emerging of new democracies in the Arab world with a strong mechanism of accountability to their people, and Israel cannot ignore that their claim of being the only democracy in the Middle East will gradually disappear. Israel has to take immediate decision, either to choose isolation and to face a very difficult political option, such as the one-state solution, or taking a courageous decision to support the two-state solution. Israel needs to choose between settlements and peace, and I hope it will choose peace. The Arab Peace Initiative is a golden opportunity for Israel to grasp. It's fair, comprehensive, and responsive to all needs and concerns of all parties. Thank you very much for your kind attention. Multiculturalism in Australia, and we appreciate, this tolerance, forgiveness, and the coexisting between different ethnicities and faiths. This is a very good model for Israel-Palestine, I think. But look, before the establishment of Israel, Jews and Muslims and Christians were living together in peaceful and harmony. And this is, certified, qualified by many researchers. They were our neighbors and all things. I don't think it's a sort of hatred, culture or whatever. It's just, we have an occupation. And Palestinians would like to see an independent state. And they want to cooperate with Israel. And they want to be good neighbors together. And because of that is our vision, is to establish a Palestinian state to exist peacefully with Israel. I mean, if we want to also to implement the Australian model, we like the one-state solution. We proposed to Israel several times. From 1965 until 1988, we talked about one democratic, secular state in which the three faiths, live together side by side. So this is our vision from the beginning. Unfortunately, because of that Israel insists on a Jewish state, because of their history, because they are, hostages to the Holocaust, whatever. But we understand their fears. Yeah, it's up to them. They want to have their own state. And because of that, we were practical and agree, to establish our own state on only 22% of Palestine. This was a huge compromise for Palestinians. We have 6 million Palestinians outside Palestine who were, expelled in 1948. And these guys are supporting the two-state solution, supporting the recognition of Israel. So they show a sort of leadership in this process. I recognize, I admit that there are very difficult issues between us and the Israelis. But I think the process was very empowering through the Oslo negotiations. The process itself was the final product. We know each other. We identify the problems together. And I'm very optimistic that, it's not necessarily with the short period, whatever, maybe 5 years or whatever, we will, reach a sort of solution between us and the Israelis. Because the other alternatives are disaster. What is the alternative? Is the continuation of bloodshed, the control of the extremists on Palestine and Israel, still the hatred and incitement. And so who's benefit from that? Nothing. We'd like to see like what happened in Europe after the Second World War. People come and talk to each other. And this is my vision, and this is, I share this vision with many of Palestinians who really to see a sort of stability and peace. It needs time. We need to work hard. We need also the mediation of Australia. Because with this model of Australia, I can introduce different models of coexistence. And Australia has started, to be more engaged, involved in this process, and we appreciate its role. Bob Carr was there yesterday in Palestine, and he has very strong positions against the settlements, and he supported the establishment of a Palestinian state. So there is a progress. It needs some time. It needs leadership, and it needs more responsive to the interests and needs of both people. This is a very good question, because there is a sort of genuine, substantial discussion now within Palestinians, between Palestinians and their colleagues from the Arab states about the strategy and vision. Because we have a good assessment of what's happening now on the ground, and all of us see that the expansion of settlements, whatever, will undermine to a certain extent the establishment of a Palestinian state. So there is a discussion about what would be the best vision, approach, strategy to solve this problem now. And to be frank with you, still, we don't have an outcome of this, discussion, because there is a very strong opinion views within the Palestinian people that we should go to the United Nations and we should, submit a bid for now non-member state, because we failed last year in the Security Council to get a sort of full member state, unfortunately, because we did not succeed to guarantee 9 votes to submit a proposal this bid to Security Council. So, and there is a lot of opposition now to this position from the Europeans and Americans and even some Arab states, who try to convince us to delay the process for a while until the election of Obama, because we don't want to embarrass Obama now, because then if we submit a proposal to the United Nations, he will be obliged to stop the money and funding to Palestinians, unfortunately. And of course, he threatened also to close our own office in Washington, our embassy delegation in Washington and Israel. Of course, there will be a lot of reactions, because they will annex, they said, the North Valley, they will stop giving us our own taxes. So it's a lot of, it's a parcel of, it's punishment, things against the Palestinians if they decide to go to the United Nations. So we try to sort of, to conduct a sort of risk assessment, to be the best. In the other side, still, seek the support of the United States. This is very important for us. We established very close relations with Australia, with America, and this is true with Australia, with also America for the last 40 years. And I think we need the Americans to mediate because they have influence on the Israelis. Although, I mean, we have a lot of criticism to the American policy because they are biased and they are not honest broker, and we know exactly what's happening there. But we are also responsible of this position of the United States because we don't have sufficient Arab pressure using their own, strength to pressure the Americans' position. We don't have a strong lobby in the United States compared to the Jewish lobby. I mean, we don't put a lot of money in the media, and we don't form a sort of strong lobby to influence, the decision-making processes and structure in the United States, unfortunately. So still, we need the interference brokering with the United States, but at the same time, for the last 22 years of negotiations with Israel, the outcome, unfortunately, is zero. And we need a third party to interfere. And we don't think that bilateral negotiation is sufficient because we are under occupation and Israel is an occupying power. No balance equity between us and the Israelis. Instead of negotiation, they are imposing on us. They are putting a lot of conditions. And because of that, we need somebody to support us. We can't continue this kind of endless negotiation. As we say all the time, we're not interested in the process itself. We are interested in the outcome of this process, which is the peace. And it was agreed in Oslo that the outcome of this process is to establish a Palestinian state. And unfortunately now, we failed to end the occupation and we failed to establish a Palestinian state. And this is a big failure for the international community, for the United States, and for EU and all other stakeholders. So it's expected that we'll go to the United Nations. We'd like, the interference of the international community. And there will be a lot of consequences if we succeed, and this is guaranteed because we have a sort of majority in the 132 countries recognize Palestine now, and we expect more overwhelming support to us if we go to the United Nations for non-member state. This will, if it happens, it will be useful for Israel because first time we both agree on borders because our bid saying Palestinian state in 1960 the border coexist peacefully with Israel. So this is now the process. There is a lot of discussion. Arab Spring, involved. We talk to our, the Arab countries. We have a special committee within the Arab League. I need to discuss this issue. Yes, well, I think this is absolutely right, and I said in my paper that, also United States can ignore anymore, the developments in the Arab world. They will not have puppets now, or somebody who just support their own policy, on the expense of the people's interest and their needs and priorities and their social agenda. I think it's the Arabs now will stick to their own national agendas and their own national security interests. As a responsible parties in the international arena. So yes, I think United States should take into consideration these developments, and I think they are now because they are in a big dilemma with Israel. If they continue this approach, just biased to Israel, and they don't respond to a sort of just solution to Israel-Palestine, they will lose their own credibility, in the Arab world, and they have a huge interest in the Arab world, and they are very keen, I think, to continue this relationship. To protect also the Israeli security interest, like they want to maintain Camp David accord with Egypt, so they are engaged now, involved in a sort of genuine discussion with Brotherhood movement. I think this is the most important phenomenon now within Arab Spring, in which Americans are supporting the moderation voice within the Brotherhood movement and try to work with them, to sort of adopting a modern voice. So it depends on how the Arabs will act with the Americans, try to negotiate now based on support of their people, not support of anything. So I think they should respond to these new challenges. I don't know how, to what extent, what they are going to do, but I believe maybe Obama will try to do something if he's elected. Maybe all the time we have speculation about second round with the Americans, whatever, and they will be free from Jewish lobby and other international commitments. But I think I have feelings, just sort of feeling that Obama will do something this time, taking into consideration the emerging democracies in the Arab world. I think Tony Blair tried to do something, tried to support the developmental process in Palestine, and talk to all stakeholders, in particular Israelis, to allow Palestinians to implement certain projects and other things. Unfortunately, he has very restricted mandate by the quartet, and if he has more expanded mandate, he will do much better than what he did until now. Recently we have a problem with him because of certain positions he adopted with the Israelis and other things, but still we're dealing with him, and I hope that he will succeed in his negotiation with Israel, to support certain projects, especially in Area C. Because Area C is very important now for us as Palestinians, because it consists more than 60% of the total land of Palestine, and we don't have access to. According to Oslo Agreement, it's 3 areas, A, B, C, and the most populated area are Area A, in which we are allowed to do things. Area B is a joint security and joint control between us and the Israelis, and Area C, which 60% is totally under the control of Israelis, and we don't have access to it. So as one of our own now developmental objectives is to convince the international community, quartet, and Tony Blair is working hard for that, is to convince the Israelis to allow the Palestinians to have access to this area, which will have a huge impact on our own economy, and it will increase our own GDP, immensely. So this is an important issue. So we will continue working with Tony Blair to coordinate the humanitarian assistance, developmental assistance, but at the same time, we have our own direct contact with donors and agencies, and we're really very proud of these relationships because it's based on actual equal partnership. And I'd like to thank Ozaid now, both of them, Nicholas and Saeed is here. They were very helpful in facilitating the funds to the Palestinian people. Australia now is 7th or 8th donor to Palestine with more than $60 to $70 million annually, with 50 scholarships to Palestinians for postgraduate study here, and very prestigious training program called ALA, Australian Leadership Award Program, which Sohail is running this program. She was good also at raising a lot of funds for working with Ozaid as partner, and we're happy with this kind of cooperation. For the reconciliation, internal reconciliation between Fatah and Hamas, as I mentioned in my paper, we signed both the Cairo Agreement, which is a framework for, to solve the problem between the two parties. As I said, there are sort of relevant progress of Hamas positions towards the establishment of Palestinian state in 1967. There is also progress in their position towards the non-violent approach to popular resistance, which is really good. And the Palestinian Authority at Hamas now is meeting regularly really to discuss things. The problem now is, this is a sort of personal view, like they stopped the election committee in Gaza. According to the agreement with Hamas, we'd like to unify again between Gaza and West Bank through an election process, supposed to be like last June. Unfortunately, because of the delay of the implementation of the agreement, it didn't work. So Hamas, it's two important issues. We agreed to, in Doha, last agreement, to conduct the elections and to start the counting of voters in Gaza and the West Bank. The second important step is to establish a sort of technocrat government to observe the implementation of the agreement and to observe also the conduction of the elections in Gaza and West Bank. What happened is that Hamas stopped the election committee from counting the voters in Gaza, and accordingly President Abbas stops the forming of the government, because the objective of this government is to observe the elections. This is the main task of it. But my view analysis is that why Hamas stopped these elections? Why Hamas they don't want elections in the West Bank and Gaza? And I think they believe that the balance of power is changed with the Brotherhood in Egypt, because there is now a president in Egypt who belongs to the Brotherhood movement. And there is a very bad situation in Gaza. People will not elect Hamas again. This is also a personal view, but also supported by a lot of opinion polls. Because of the bad situation, economic situation, also the freedoms, the democracy, whatever, people in Gaza will not elect Hamas in this situation. So Hamas thought that if the Rafah crossings is open between Egypt and Gaza, this will improve the lifestyle and the economic situation in the West Bank, and they will be in a good position. Because people say, look, the money is there in Ramallah, and we are in a very bad situation. Why you want to elect, I mean, from rational point, why you want to elect, Hamas again? For them, they want first to improve the situation. They want to get more popularity and support, public support, and then they will agree on the elections. Also, to be balanced, I think we faced, as Palestinian Authority and PLO, a lot of pressure from international, community, because the courted requirements for Hamas to be a part of the process is complicated for Hamas. It's 3 conditions. They should abide by the previous agreements, like Oslo agreement. This is difficult for Hamas. The second is they should adopt like peaceful approach to resistance, and it's okay now. They recognize that, taking into consideration what's happened in the Arab region. They can't ignore it. And the third is, and this is the difficult, to recognize Israel. So these are the 3 prerequisites to Hamas to be a part of this process. So, and because of that, like the President Abu Mazen like to have a sort of problem-solving approach in which say this government is technocrat, this is my government, and the ministers will be my ministers, and I'm the head of the executive branch, and I will decide about this policy, and try to adhere this government to 3 conditions. So it is complicated a little bit. There are a lot of pressure on the Palestinian Authority, from Americans, Israelis, that Hamas to accept all these prerequisites, and at the same time, Hamas feels that it's not suitable for them now to hold the election and to unify West Bank and Gaza. I hope that the Egyptian leadership, has hosted, both sides last month, and I hope, they will continue their positive role really in mediation between the 2 parties and try to convince 2 parties. And we have an opportunity here because Hamas will not challenge the leadership now in Egypt, and I hope that leadership will convince Hamas to unify, because this is a prerequisite also for a sort of just solution in Palestine. This is very important. It has its own logistical, practical problems here in Australia because we don't have any kind of recognition in Australia of the general Palestinian delegation. We don't have any legal status. We don't have any diplomatic status. This creates a lot of problems, logistical and practical problems in front of us. Like we can't open a bank account, as an example, in the name of the general delegation of Palestine until now. We pay tax, and I'd like really to thank very much Professor Stanhope for his support to us when we purchased 2 premises here in Australia, and and it was a big step from Australian government that they accept that we registered these 2 premises in the name of Palestinian Liberation Organization, PLO. This was a big step, recognition of Australia of PLO as an international body. Professor Stanhope, raised the issue of Kevin Rudd several times. He wrote a lot of letters to Kevin Rudd to increase the recognition of the delegation here. And also he wrote a lot of articles in the Canberra Times. He was a very good lobbyist and advocate for the case of the, especially for what we call it the tax, the tax for the buildings. It's about 91,000 stamp duties. So although Australia is a big donor to us, but we pay like $90,000 as stamp duty on the 2 premises, and this was a discussion between me and His Excellency, when we discussed this issue. So, in spite of all these circumstances, we're happy with our own bilateral relation with Australia, as I mentioned before. I'm invited to all receptions by DFAT or formal bodies. I'm an active part of the International Diplomatic Corps. I'm invited to all the functions, events, whatever. And I should appreciate the role of my colleagues, the Arab ambassadors here. Really, they were very supportive to me. And we have a regular meeting in the Council of Arab Ambassadors, and all the time I received a huge support from them. This is not in front of His Excellency the Egyptian and the Kuwaiti ambassador, but this is a reality. This support gives me more opportunity in front of the Australian government because they insist, and I'll give you an example. It's about the names in the table. And of course, because I'm not a full ambassador in head of general delegation, it's not necessarily that they follow the Arab League system that according to the names, because sometimes they are in seating, putting the Palestinian ambassador in a different seat, whatever. And I remember the Egyptian ambassador told him, no, I mean, you should come and sit here. And he insisted that I should sit beside my colleagues, the ambassadors, and not sit, whatever. So this kind of support is really important. And I want also to thank the embassies of Malaysia and Indonesia as belonging to the Islamic also, in which also they provide me a lot of support, invite me to all their functions and things. So I think, Kevin Rudd was the former foreign minister, was very interested in this issue, upgrading of the general delegation in Palestine, and he formed a committee led by former representative of Australia in Ramallah called Benjamin Scott, who's starting a dialogue about upgrading our own status. So we started the process, but this is for me important, but the most important thing is the essence, substance of this relationship, which is really mutual, and we achieved a lot. We signed an agreement now with the Australian government for the first time. They had budget support to Palestinian Authority, recognized Palestinian Authority, and we signed an agreement also between Australia and UNRWA for $18 million annually. So there is sort of formal relationship, and we have an active representative office in Ramallah for Australia and for the diplomatic representation. Kevin Rudd visited Palestine 3 times last year, and now we've visited also Ramallah. Julia Gillard visited Ramallah once and met with the officials there. And a lot of parliamentarian, groups also visited Ramallah. So there is a growing discussion, and I met with the Prime Minister, I met with Kevin Rudd and Bob Carr several times. So we have a sort of good starting a process of good relation with Australia. And Australia political procedure, this is the most important thing for us, is not just diplomatic immunities and privileges. The immunities and privileges has an essence which is the bilateral relation and diplomatic relation. This is the most important outcome of it, not just immunities and diplomatic privileges and other things. So it's growing. We're still lobbying here with our own friends. We start an active diplomacy, a proactive diplomacy in the Pacific countries. Now 3 countries recognize Palestine: East Timor, Vanuatu, and Papua New Guinea. And we start a dialogue and discussion with Solomon Islands, Tonga, and Fiji. I met with the Fijian foreign minister 4 days ago. He was in a visit to Australia. And now the application for Palestine to establish diplomatic relation on the table with all these islands. So we have a proactive diplomacy now with the Pacific countries, and I hope that will have as well.